Hello and welcome to continuous integration tutorial using Jenkins. My name is Chidanand and I am with the Simplilearn team. Today, let's get started with Jenkins. Jenkins, in my opinion, is one of the most popular continuous integration servers of recent times. What began as a hobby project by a developer working for Sun Microsystems way back in early or mid 2000s has gradually and eventually evolved into very powerful and robust automation servers. It has a wide adoption since it is released under MIT license and is almost free to use. Jenkins has a vast developer community that supports it by writing all kinds of plugins. Plugins is the heart and soul of Jenkins because using plugins, one can connect Jenkins to anything and everything under the sun. With that introduction, let's get into what all will be covered as a part of this tutorial. I will get into some of the prerequisites required for installing Jenkins, post which I will go ahead and install Jenkins on a Windows box. There are a few first-time configurations that needs to be done, and I will be covering those as well. So once I have Jenkins installed and configured properly, I will get into the user administrative part. I'll create few users and I will use some plugins for setting up various kinds of access permissions for these users. I will also put in some freestyle jobs. Freestyle job is nothing but a very simple job, and I will also show you the powerfulness of Jenkins by scheduling this particular job to run based upon a time schedule. I will also connect Jenkins with GitHub. GitHub is our source code repository where I've got some repositories put up there. So using Jenkins, I will connect to GitHub, pull up a repository that is existing on GitHub onto the Jenkins box and run few commands to build this particular repository that is pulled from GitHub. Sending out emails is a very important configurations of Jenkins or any other continuous integration server for that matter. Whenever there is any notifications that has to be sent out as a part of either a build going bad or build being good or build being propagated to some environment and all these scenarios, you would need the continuous integration servers to be sending out notifications. So I will get into a little bit details of how to configure Jenkins for sending out emails. I will also get into a scenario where I would have a web application, a Maven based Java web application, which will be pulled from a GitHub repository and I will deploy it onto a Tomcat server. The Tomcat server will be locally running on my system. Eventually, I will get into one other very important topic, which is the master slave configuration. It's a very important and pretty interesting topic where distributed builds is achieved using a master slave configuration. So I will bring up a slave, I will connect the slave with the master, and I will also put in a job and kind of delegate that particular job to the slave configuration. Finally, I will let you know how to use some plugins to back up your Jenkins. So Jenkins has got a lot of useful information set up on it in terms of the build environments, in terms of workspace. All this can be very easily backed up using a plugin. So this is what I'm going to be covering as a part of this tutorial. Jenkins is a web application that is written in Java, and there are various ways in which you can use and install Jenkins. I have listed popular 3 mechanisms in which Jenkins is usually installed on any system. The topmost one is as a Windows or a Linux based services. So if at all you have Windows like the way I have, and I'm going to use this mechanism for this demo. So I would download a MSI installer that is specific to Jenkins and install this service. So whenever I install it as a service, it goes ahead and nicely installs all that is required for my Jenkins. And I have a service that can be started or stopped based upon my need. Any flavor of Linux as well. One other way of running Jenkins is downloading this generic war file, and as long as you have JDK installed, you can launch this war file by the command opening up a command prompt or shell prompt if at all you're on Linux box, specifying java-jar and the name of this war file. It typically brings up your web application and you can continue with your installation. The only thing being, if at all you want to stop using Jenkins, you just go ahead and close this prompt. You either do a Control-C and then bring down this prompt and your Jenkins server would be down. Other older versions of Jenkins were run popularly using this way, in which you already have a Java-based web server up and running. So you kind of drop in this war file into the root folder or the HTTPD root folder of your web server. So Jenkins would explode and kind of bring up your application. All user credentials or user administration is all taken care of by the Apache or the Tomcat server or the web server on which Jenkins is running. This was a very older way of running, but still some people use it because if they don't want to maintain 2 servers, if they already have a Java web server which it's being nicely maintained and backed up, Jenkins can run attached to it. Alright, so either ways, it doesn't matter however you're going to bring up your Jenkins instance. The way we're going to operate Jenkins is all going to be very same or similar one with the subtle changes in terms of user administration if at all you're launching it through any other web server which will take care of the user administration. Otherwise, all the commands or all the configuration or the way in which I'm going to run this demo, it is going to be same across any of these installations. All right, so the prerequisites for running Jenkins, as I mentioned earlier, Jenkins is nothing but a simple web application that's written in Java. So all that it needs is Java, preferably JDK 1.7 or 1.8. 2 GB RAM is the recommended RAM for running Jenkins. And also, like any other open source toolsets, when you install JDK, ensure that you set in the environment variable Java home to point to the right directory. This is something very specific to JDK, but for any other open source tools that you install, there is always a preferred environment variable that you got to set in, which is specific to that particular tool that you're going to use. This is a generic thing that is there for, for any other open source projects, because the way open source projects discover themselves is using these environment variables. So as a general practice or a good practice, always set these environment variables accordingly. So I already have JDK 1.8 installed on my system, but in case you do not, what I would recommend is just navigate on your browser to the Oracle homepage and just type in or search for install JDK 1.8 and navigate to the Oracle homepage. You'll have to accept the license agreement, and there are a bunch of installers that you can pick up based upon the operating system on which you're running. So I have this Windows 64 installer that is already installed and running on my system. So I will not get into the details of downloading this or installing it. Let me show you once I install this, what I've done with regard to my path. So if you get into this environment variables, all right, so I've just set in a Java home variable. If you see this, C colon program files Java JDK 1.8. This is where my Java is located. C program files Java. Okay, so this is the home directory of my JDK. So that is what I've set it up here in my environment variable. So if you see here, this is my Java home. All right, one other thing to do is ensure that in case you want to run Java or JavaC from a command prompt, ensure that you also add that path into this path variable. So if you see this, somewhere I will see, yes, there you go. C colon program files Java JDK 1.8 bin. So with these two, I'll ensure that my Java installation is nice and good enough. So to check that, to double check that or to verify that, let me just open up a simple command prompt. And if I type in Java -version, all right, and Java C -version. So the compiler is on the path, Java is on the path. And if at all I do this, even the environment variable specific to my Java is installed correctly. So I'm good to go ahead with my Jenkins installation. Now that I have my prerequisites all set for installing Jenkins, let me just go ahead and download Jenkins. So let me open up a browser and say download Jenkins. All right. LTS is nothing but the long-term support. These are all stable versions. Weeklies, I would not recommend that you try these unless until you have a real need for that. Long-term support is good enough. And as I mentioned, there are so many flavors of Jenkins that is available for download. You also have a Docker container wherein you can launch Jenkins as a container, but I'll not get into details of that in this tutorial. All right, so what I want is, yes, this is the WAR file, which is a generic WAR file that I was talking to you earlier, and this is the Windows MSI installer. So go ahead and download this MSI installer. I already have that downloaded, so let me just open that up. All right, so this is my downloaded Jenkins instance, or rather installer. This is maybe a few months old, but this is good enough for me. Before you start Jenkins installation, just be aware of one fact that there is a variable called Jenkins Home. This is where Jenkins would store all this configuration data, jobs, project workspace, and all that specific to Jenkins. So by default, if at all you don't set this to any particular directory, if at all you install an MSI installer, all your installation gets into C colon program files 86 and Jenkins folder. If at all you run a war file, depending upon the user ID with which you're running a war file, the Jenkins folder, there's a .jenkins folder that gets created inside the user home directory. So in case you have any need wherein you want to back up your Jenkins or you want Jenkins installations to get into some specific directories, go ahead and set this Jenkins home variable accordingly before you even begin your installation. For now, I don't need to do any of these things, so I've already downloaded the installer. Let me just go ahead with the default installation. All right, so this is my Jenkins MSI installer. I don't want to make any changes into the Jenkins configuration. C: program files is good for me. Yeah, this is where all my destination folder and all the configuration specific to it goes. I'm happy with this. I don't want to change this. I would just say go ahead and click installation. Okay, so what typically happens once the Jenkins installation gets through is it'll start installing itself, and there are some small checks that needs to be done. So, and by default, Jenkins launches on the port 8080. So let me just open up localhost 8080. There's a small checking that will be done as a part of the installation process, wherein I need to type in a hash key. All right. So there's a very, very simple hash key that gets stored out here. So I'll have to just copy this path. If at all you're running as a war file, you would see that in your logs. All right. So this is a simple hash key that gets created every time when you do a Jenkins installation. So as a part of the installation, it just asks you to do this. So if that is not correct, it'll crib about it, but this looks good. So it's going ahead. All right. One important part during the installation. So you would need to install some recommended plugins. What happens is the plugins are all related to each other. So it's like the typical RPM kind of a problem where you try to install some plugin and it's got a dependency which is not installed and you get into all those issues. In order to get rid of that, what Jenkins recommends, there's a bunch of plugins that is already recommended. So just go ahead and blindly click that install recommended plugin. So if you see, there is a whole lot of plugins which are bare essential plugins that is required for Jenkins in order to run properly. So Jenkins as a part of the installation would get all these plugins and then install it for you. This is a good combination to kind of begin with. And mind you, at this moment Jenkins needs lots of bandwidth in terms of network. So in case your network is not so good, few of these plugins would kind of fail. And these plugins are all available on openly or mirrored sites, and sometimes some of them may be down. So do not worry in case some of these plugins kind of fail to install. You'd get an option to kind of retry installing them, but just ensure that at least most or 90-95% of all these plugins are installed without any problems. Let me pause the video here for a minute and then get back once all these plugins are installed. My plugin installation is all good. There was no failures in any of my plugins. So after that, I get to create this first admin user. Again, this is one important point that you got to remember. Give in any username and password, but ensure that you kind of remember that because it's very hard to get back your username and password in case you forget it. All right, so I'm going to create a very, very simple username and password, something that I can remember. That's my name, and an email ID is kind of optional, but it doesn't allow me to go ahead in case I don't. So I just give in an admin and I got a password. I remember my password. This is my full name. All right, I say save and finish. All right, that kind of completed my Jenkins installation. It was not that tough, was it? Now that I have my Jenkins installed correctly, let me quickly walk you through some bare minimal configurations that is required. These are kind of a first time configuration that is required. So, and also let me warn you, the UI is little hard for many people to wrap their head around it, specifically the Windows guys. But if at all you're a Java guy, you know how painful it is to write UI in Java, you will kind of appreciate, all the effort that has gone into the UI. Bottom line, UI is little hard to, wrap your head around it, but once you start using it, possibly you'll start liking it. All right. So let me get into something called as Manage Jenkins. This can be viewed like a main menu for all Jenkins configuration. So I'll get into some of those important ones. something called as configure system. Configure system, this is where you kind of put in the configuration for your complete Jenkins instance. Few things to kind of look out for. This is a home directory. This is a Java home where all the configurations, all the workspace, anything and everything regarding Jenkins is stored out here. System message, you want to put in some message on the system, you just type in whatever you want and it's possibly show up somewhere up here on the menu. Number of executors, very, very important configuration. This just lets Jenkins know at any point in time how many jobs or how many threads can be run. You can kind of visualize it like a thread that can be run on this particular instance. As a thumb rule, if at all you're on a single core system, number of executors 2 should be good enough. In case at any point in time, if there are multiple jobs that kind of get triggered at the same time, in case the number of executors are less compared to the number of jobs that have woken up, no need to panic because they will all get queued up and eventually Jenkins will get to running those jobs. Just bear in mind that whenever a new job kind of gets triggered, the CPU usage and the memory usage in terms of the disk write is very high on the Jenkins instance. So that's something that you got to kind of keep in mind. All right, but number of executors, 2 for my system is kind of good. Label for my Jenkins, I don't want any of these things. Usage, how do you want to use your Jenkins? This is good for me because I only have a primary server that is running. So I want to use this node as much as possible. Quiet period. Each of these options have got some bare minimal help kind of a thing that is out here. By clicking on these question marks, you will get to know as to what are these particular configurations. All right, so this all look good. What I want to show you here is there's something regarding the Docker, timestamps, Git plugin, SVN, email notifications. I don't want that. What I want I want this SMTP server configuration. Remember, I mentioned earlier that I would want Jenkins to be sending out some emails. And what I've done here is I've just configured the SMTP details of my personal email ID. In case you're in an organization, you would have some sort of an email IDs that is set up for a Jenkins server. So you can specify the SMTP server details of your company so that you can authorize Jenkins to kind of send out emails. But in case you want to try it out like me, I have configured my personal email ID, which is on my Gmail, for sending out notifications. So the SMTP server would be smtp.gmail.com. I'm using the SMTP authentication. I've provided my email ID and my password. I'm using the SMTP port, which is 465, and reply to address is the same as mine. I can just send out an email and see if at all this configuration works. Again, Gmail would not allow you to allow anybody to send out notifications on your behalf. So you'll have to lower the security level of your Gmail ID so that you can allow programmatically somebody to send out email notifications on your behalf. So I've done already that. I'm just trying to see if I can send a test email with the configurations that I've set in. Yes. All right. So the email configuration looks good. So this is how you configure your Gmail account in case you want to do that. If not, put in your organization SMTP server details, which are with a valid username and password, and it should all be set. All right, so no other configurations that I'm going to change here. All of these look good. All right, so I come back to manage Jenkins. Okay, one other thing that I want to kind of go over is the global tool configuration. Imagine this scenario, or look at it this way. Jenkins is a continuous integration server. It doesn't know what kind of a code base it's going to pull in, what kind of a tool set that is required, or what is the code that it's going to pull in and how is it going to build. So you would have to put in all the tools that is required for building the appropriate kind of code that you're going to pull in from your source code repositories. So just to give an example, in case your source code is a Java source code, and assuming that because in this demo, this is my laptop and I've put in all the configurations, JDK, everything on my laptop because I'm a developer, I'm working on the laptop. But my continuous integration server would be a separate server without anything being installed on it. So in case I want Jenkins to run a Java code, I would need to install JDK on it. I need to specify the JDK location of this out here this way. Okay, since I already have the JDK installed and I've already put in the Java home directory, or rather the environment variable correctly, I don't need to do it. Git, if at all I want the Jenkins server to use Git, Git is a command bash or the command prompt for running Git and connecting to any other Git server. So you would need Git to be installed on that particular system and set the path accordingly. Gradle and Maven, if at all you have some Mavens as well, you want to do this. Any other tool that you're going to install on your system, which is your continuous integration server, you will have to come in here and configure something. In case you don't configure it, when Jenkins runs, it will not be able to find these tools for building your task and it'll crib about it. That's good. I don't want to save anything. Manage Jenkins. Let me see what else is required. Yes, configure global security. All right, the security is enabled. And if you see by default, it's the security access control is set to Jenkins own user database. So what does this mean? Jenkins by default, it uses file system where it stores all the usernames, which hashes up these usernames and kind of stores them. So as of now, Jenkins is configured to use its own database. Assuming that you are running in an organization, you would probably want to have some sort of an AD or an LDAP server using which you would want to control access to your Jenkins repository, rather Jenkins tool. So you would specify your LDAP server details, the root DN, password or the manager DN and the manager password and all these details in case you want to connect your Jenkins instance with your LDAP or AD or any of the authentication servers that you have in your organization. But for now, since I don't have any of these things, I'm going to use this own database. That's good enough. All right. So I will set up some authorization methods and stuff like that once I put in few jobs. So for now, let me not get into any of these details of this. Just be aware that Jenkins can be connected for authorization to an LDAP server, or you can have Jenkins managing its own servers, which is happening as of now. So I'm going to save all this stuff. That's good for me. So enough of all these configurations. Let me put in a very, very simple job. All right. So job, new item, little difficult to kind of figure out, but then that's the new item. So I'll just say, first job, this is good for me. I just give a name for my job. I would say it's a freestyle project. That's good enough for me. I don't want to choose any of that. So unless until you choose any of this particular button would not become active. So choose the freestyle project and say, okay. At a very high level, you would see general source code management, build triggers, build environment, build and post build. In case you install more and more plugins, you will see a lot more options. But for now, this is what you would see. So what am I doing? At the moment, I'm just putting up a very, very simple job. And the job could be anything and everything. So I don't want to put in a very complicated job for now. For the demo purpose, let me just put in a very, very simple job. I'll give a description. This is an optional thing. This is my first Jenkins job. All right. I don't want to choose any of these. Again, there are some helps available here. I don't want to choose any of this. I don't want to connect it into any source code for now. I don't want any triggers for now. I'll come back to this in a while. Build environment. I don't want any build environment. As a part of this build step, I just want to, run few things so that I kind of complete this particular job. So since I'm on a Windows box, I would say execute Windows batch command. All right. So what do you want to do? Let me just echo something. Echo, hello. This is my first Jenkins job, and possibly I would want the date and the timestamp pertaining to the job. I mean, the date and time in which this job was run. All right. Very, very simple command that says, this is my first job. It just puts out something along with the date and the time. All right. I don't want to do anything else. I want to keep this job as simple as this. So let me save this job. All right. So once I save this job, the job names comes up here, and then I need to build this job. And you would see some build history out here. Nothing is there as of now because I've just put in a job. I have not run it yet. All right. So let me try to build it now. You see a build number, you would see a date and a timestamp. So if I click on this, you would see a console output. If I go here, okay, as simple as that. And where is all the job details that is getting into? If you see this, if I navigate to this particular directory, all right, so this is the directory what I was mentioning earlier regarding Jenkins home. So all the job related stuff that is specific to this particular Jenkins installation is all here. all the plugins that is installed. The details of each of those plugins can be found here. All right. So the workspace is where all the jobs that I've created, whichever I'm running, there will be individual folders specific to the jobs that has been put up here. All right. So one job, one quick run. That's what it looks like. Pretty simple. Okay, let me do one thing. Let me put up a second job. I would say second job. I would say freestyle project. All right, this is my second job. I just want to demonstrate the powerfulness of the automation server and how simple it is to automate a job that is put up on Jenkins, which will be triggered automatically. Remember what I said earlier about Jenkins, because at the core of Jenkins is a very, very powerful automation server. All right, so what I'm going to do, I will just keep everything else the same. I'm going to put in a build script pretty much similar to second job that gets triggered automatically every minute. All right, let me do that. Percentage date, and I'll put in the time. All right. So I just put in another job called second job, and it pretty much does the same thing as what I was doing earlier in terms of printing the date and the time. But this time, I'm just going to demonstrate the powerfulness of the automation server that is there. If you see here, there's a build trigger. So a build can be triggered using various triggers that is there. So we'll get into this GitHub triggering or hook or a webhook kind of a triggering later on. But for now, what I want to do, I want to ensure that this job that I'm going to put in would be automatically triggered on its own. Let's say every minute, I want this job to be run on its own. So build periodically is my setting. If you see here, there's a bunch of help that is available for me. So for those of you who have written cron jobs on Linux boxes, you'll find it very, very simple. But for others, don't panic. Let me just put up a very, very simple regular expression for scheduling this job every minute. All right, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, come up, come up, come up. All right, so 5 stars is all that I'm going to put in. And Jenkins got a little worried and is asking me, do you really mean every minute? Oh yeah, I want to do this every minute. Let me save this. And how do I check whether it gets triggered every minute or not? I just don't do anything. I'll just wait for a minute. And if at all everything goes well, Jenkins would automatically trigger my second job in a minute's time from now. This time around, I'm not going to trigger anything. Look, there you see. It's automatically got triggered. If I go in here, yep, second job that gets triggered automatically. It was triggered at 1642, which is 4:42 my time. That looks good. And if everything goes well, every 1 minute onwards, this job would be automatically triggered. Now that I have my Jenkins up and running, a few jobs that has been put up here on my Jenkins instance, I would need a way of controlling access to my Jenkins server. This is wherein I would use a plugin called role-based access plugin and create few rules. The rules are something like a global role and a project role, project specific role. I can have different roles and I can have users who have signed up or the users whom I create kind of assigned to these roles so that each of these users fall into some category. This is my way of kind of controlling access to my Jenkins instance and ensuring that people don't do something unwarranted. All right, so first things first, let me go ahead and install a plugin for doing that. So I get into manage Jenkins and manage plugin. A little bit of a confusing screen in my opinion. There's updates available, installed and advanced. As of now, we don't have the role-based plugin. So let me go to available. It'll take some time for it to get refreshed. All right, now these are the available plugins. These are the installed plugins. All right, so let me come back to available. And I would want to search for my role-based access plugin. So I would just search for role and hit enter. Okay, role-based authorization strategy enables user authorization using a role-based strategy. Roles can be defined globally or for particular jobs or nodes and stuff like that. So exactly, this is the plugin that I want. I would want to install it without a restart. All right, looks good so far. Yes. Go back to the top of the page. Yes. Remember, Jenkins is running on a Java using a Java instance. So typically many things would work the same way unless and until you want to restart Jenkins once in a while. But as a good practice, whenever you do some sort of a big installations or big patches on your Jenkins instance, just ensure that you kind of restart it. Otherwise, there would be a difference in terms of what is installed on the system and what is there on the file system. You would need to flush out few of those settings later on. But for now, these are all very small plugins, so these would run without any problems. But otherwise, if at all there are some plugins which would need a restart, kindly go ahead and restart your Jenkins instance. But for now, I don't need that. It looks good. I've installed the plugin. So where do I see my plugin? I installed the plugin that is specific to the user control or the access control. So let me go into, yes, global security, and I would see this role-based strategy showing up now. All right, so this comes in because of my installation of my role-based plugin. So this is what I would want to enable because I already have my own database set up. And for the authorization part, in the sense that who can do what, I'm going to install. I mean, I've already installed a role-based strategy plugin, and I'm going to enable that strategy. All right, I would say save. Okay, now I've installed the role-based access plugin. I would need to just set it up and check that, I would go ahead and create some roles and ensure that I assign users as per these roles. All right, so let me go to Manage Jenkins, configure. All right, let me see, where is this? Configure global security. Is that where I create my roles? Nope, not here. Yes, manage and assign roles. Okay. Again, you would see these options only after you install these plugins. So for now, I've just enabled the plugin. I've enabled role-based access control, and I would go ahead and create some roles for this particular Jenkins instance. So I would say first manage roles. So I would need to create some roles here, and the roles are at a very high level. These are global roles, and there are some project roles, and there are some slave roles. I'll not get into details of all of these. At a very, very high level, which is a global role, let me just create a role. A role can be kind of visualized like a group. So I would create a role called developer. Typically, the Jenkins instance or the CA instance are kind of owned up or controlled by QA guys. So QA guys would need to provide some sort of limited access to developers. So that's why I'm creating a role called developer, and I'm adding this role at a global role level. So I would say add this here, and you would see this developer role that is there. And each of these options, if you hover over it, you would see some sort of a help on what are these permissions specific to. So what I want is, like, it sounds a little different, but I would want to give very, very little permissions for the developer. So from an administration perspective, I would just want him to have a read kind of a role. Credentials, again, I would just want a view kind of a role. I don't want him to create any agents and all that stuff. That looks good for me. For a job, I would want him to just possibly read. I don't want him to build. I don't want him to cancel any jobs. I don't want him to configure any job. I don't even want him to create any job. I would just want him to read few things. I would not give him possibly a role to the workspace as well. I mean, I don't want him to have access to the workspace. I would just want him to read a job or check, have read-only access to the job. Run. No, I don't want him to give him any particular access which will allow him to run any jobs. View, configure, yeah, possibly create, yeah. Delete, I don't want. Read, yes, definitely. And this is the specific role. So what I'm doing, I'm just creating a global role called developer, and I'm giving him very, very limited roles, in the sense that I don't want this developer to be able to run any agents, nor create jobs, or build jobs, or cancel jobs, or configure jobs. At the max, I would just want him to read a job that is already put up there. Okay, so I would save. Now I've created a role. I still don't have any users that is there on the system. So let me go ahead and create some user on the system. That's not here. I would say configure. Manage Jenkins, manage users. Okay, let me create a new user. I would call this user as, yeah, developer one sounds good. Some password that I can remember. Okay, his name is developer one, d@d.com or something like that. Okay, so this is the admin with which I kind of configured or brought up the system, and developer one is a user that I have configured. So still have not set any roles for this particular user yet. So I would go to manage Jenkins. I would say manage and assign roles. I would say assign roles. Okay, so if you see, what I'm going to do now is assign a role that is specific to that particular developer. I will find the particular user and assign him the developer role that I've already configured. The role shows up here. I would need to find my user, whoever created, and then assign him to that particular role. So if you remember, the user that I created was developer one. I would add this particular user, and now this particular user, what kind of a role I want him to have, because this is the global role that I had created. So developer, I would assign this developer one to this particular global role, and I would go ahead and save my changes. Now let me check the permissions of this particular user by logging out of my admin account and logging back as developer one. If you remember, this role was created with very less privileges. So there you go. I have Jenkins, but I don't see a new item. I can't trigger a new job. I can't do anything. I see these jobs. However, I don't think so I'll be able to start this job. I don't have the permission set for that. The maximum I can do is look at the job, see what was there as a part of the console output and stuff like that. So this is a limited role that was created, and I added this developer to that particular role, which was a developer role, so that the developers don't get to configure any of the jobs, because the Jenkins instance is owned by a QA person. He doesn't want to give developer any administrative rights. So the rights that he set out by creating a developer role, and anybody who is tagged, any user who is tagged as a part of this developer role would get the same kind of permissions. And these permissions can be, fine grained. It can be a project specific permissions as well. But for now, I just demonstrated the high level permission that I had set in. Let me quickly log out of this user and get back as the admin user, because I need to continue with my demo. With the developer role that was created, I have very, very less privileges. One of the reasons for Jenkins being so popular, as I mentioned earlier, is the bunch of plugins that is provided by users or community users who don't charge any money for these plugins, but it's got plugins for connecting anything and everything. So if you can navigate to, or if you can find Jenkins plugins, you would see index of over so many plugins that is there. All of these are wonderful plugins. Whatever connectors that you would need, if you want to connect Jenkins to an AWS instance, or you want to connect Jenkins to a Docker instance, or any of those containers, you would have a plugin. You can go and search up. If I want to connect Jenkins to Bitbucket, Bitbucket is one of the Git servers. There's so many plugins that is available. Okay, so bottom line, Jenkins without plugins is nothing. So plugins is the heart of Jenkins. For you to connect, or in order to connect Jenkins with any of the containers or any of the other tool sets, you would need the plugins. If you want to connect, or you want to build a repository which has got Java and Maven, you would need to install Maven and JDK on your Jenkins instance. If at all you're looking for a .NET build or a Microsoft build, you would need to have MS Build installed on your Jenkins instance, and the plugins that will trigger MS Build. If at all you want to listen to some server-side webhooks from GitHub, you would need GitHub specific plugins. If you want to connect Jenkins to AWS, you need those plugins. If you want to connect to a Docker instance that is running anywhere in the world, as long as you have the URL which is publicly reachable, you just have a Docker plugin that is installed on your Jenkins instance. SonarQube is one of the popular static code analyzers. So you can connect a Jenkins build, you can build a job on Jenkins and push it to SonarQube and get SonarQube to run analysis on that and get back the results in Jenkins. All of these works very well because of the plugins. Now with that, let me connect our Jenkins instance to GitHub. I already have a very, very simple Java repository up on my GitHub instance. So let me connect Jenkins to this particular GitHub instance and pull out a job that is put up there. All right. So this is my very, very simple, repository that is there called Hello Java. And this is what is there in the repo. There is a hello.java application that is here, or a simple class file that is there. It's got just one line of system.out. So this is already present on github.com at this place, and this would be the URL for this repository. If I pick up the HTTPS URL, this is my HTTPS URL. So what I would do is I would connect my Jenkins instance to go to GitHub, provide my credentials, and pull out this repository which is on the cloud hosted github.com, and get it to my Jenkins instance, and then build this particular Java file. I'm keeping the source code very, very simple. It's just a Java file. How do I build my Java file? How do I compile my Java file? I just say Java C and the name of my class file, which is hello.java. And how do I run my Java file? I would say Java and hello. Okay, so remember, I don't need to install any plugins now, because what it needs is a Git plugin. So if you remember, when we were doing the installation, there was a bunch of recommended plugins. So Git is already installed on my system, so I don't need to install it again. So let me put up a new job here. It says Git job. Let it be a freestyle project. That's good for me. I would say okay. All right, so the source code management. Remember, in the earlier examples, we did not use any source code because we were just putting up some echo kind of jobs. We did not need any integration with any of the source code systems. So now let me connect this. So I'm going to put up a source code, and Git would show up because the plugin is already there. SVN, Perforce, any of those additional source code management tools, if at all you would need, just install those plugins, and Jenkins connects wonderfully well to all these particular source control tools. Okay, so I would copy the HTTPS URL from here. I would say this is the URL that I'm supposed to go and grab my source code from. But all right, that sounds good. But what is the username and password? So I'll have to specify a username and password. All right, so I would say the username, this is my username, and this is my HTTPS credential for my job. Okay, so this is my username and this is my password. I just save this. I say add, and then I would say, use these credentials to go to GitHub, and then on my behalf, pull out a repository. All right. If at all at this stage, if there's any error in terms of Jenkins not able to find Git or the git.exe, or if my credentials are wrong, somewhere down here you would see a red message saying that something is not right. You can just go ahead and kind of fix that. For now, this looks good for me. I'm going to grab this URL. What am I going to do? This step would pull the source code from the GitHub, and then what would be there as a part of my build step? Because this repository just has a Java file, correct? Hello.java. So in order for me to build this, I would just say execute Windows batch command, and I would say Java C hello.java. That is the way I would build my Java code. And if I have to run it, I would just say Java hello. Pretty simple, 2 steps, and this would run after the repository contents are fetched from GitHub. So Java C, Java, that sounds good. I would say save this, and let me try to run this. Okay, if you see, there's a lot of, it executes Git on your behalf. It goes out here, it provides my credentials and says, it pulls all my repository, and by default, it will pull up the master branch that is there on my repository, and it kind of builds this whole thing, Java C hello.java, and it runs this project Java hello, and there you see, this is the output that is there. And if at all you want to look at the contents of the repository, if you can go here, this is my workspace of my system. Hang on, this is not right. Okay, Git job. If you see here, this is my hello.java. This is the same program that was there on my GitHub repository. Okay, so this is a program that was there on my GitHub repository. All right, so this was the same program that was here, and Jenkins on our behalf went over all the way to GitHub, pulled this repository from there, and then it brought it down to my local system on my Jenkins instance. It compiled it and it ran this particular application. Okay, now that I've integrated Jenkins successfully with GitHub for a simple Java application, let me build a little bit on top of it. What I will do is I have a Maven based web application that is up there as a repository in my GitHub. So this is the repository that I'm talking about. It's called MVN Web App. It's a Maven based repository. As you would know, Maven is a very simple Java based build tool that will allow you to run various targets, and it'll compile. It will, based upon the goals that you specify, it can compile, it can run some tests, and it can build a war file and even deploy it into some other server. For now, what we're going to use Maven is just for building and creating a package out of this particular web application. It contains a bunch of things, and what is important is just the index.jsp. It just contains an HTML file that is there as a part of this web application. So from a perspective of requirements, now since I'm going to connect Jenkins with this particular repository, Git, we already have that set. We only need two other things. One is Maven, because Jenkins will use Maven. So in order to use Maven, Jenkins would have to have a Maven installation that is there on the Jenkins box. And in this case, the Jenkins box is this laptop. And after I have my Maven installed, I also need a Tomcat server. Tomcat is a very simple web server that you can freely download. I'll let you know how to quickly download and install the Tomcat. All right, so download Maven first. There are various ways in which you can kind of download this Maven. There is zip files, binary zip files, and archive files. So what I've done is I've just already downloaded Maven, and if you see, I've unzipped it here. So this is the folder with which I have unzipped my Maven. So as you know, Maven again is a one open source build tool. So you'll have to set in a few configurations and set up the path. So mvn hyphen version, if I specify this, after I set in my path, Maven should work. And if at all I echo m2 home, which is nothing but the variable environment variable specific to Maven home, it is already set here. So once you unzip Maven, just set this m2 home variable to the directory where you unzipped your Maven. Also, just set the path to this particular directory /bin, because that is where your Maven executables are all found. All right, so that's with Maven. And since I've set the path and the environment variable Maven is running perfectly fine on my system, I've just verified it. Okay, next one is the Tomcat server. Download Apache Tomcat server 8.5 is what I have on my system. So I'm just going to show you where to download this from. This is where you download Tomcat server, and I already have the server downloaded. Again, this doesn't need any installation. I just unzip it here, and it kind of has a bin and configuration. I've made some subtle changes in the configuration. First and foremost, Tomcat server also by default runs on port 8080. Since we already have our Jenkins server running on port 8080, we cannot let Tomcat run on the same port. There will be a port clash. So what I've done, I've configured Tomcat to use a different port. So if I go to this configuration file here, there is a server.xml. Let me open this up here. All right. Okay. So this is the port. By default, it will be 8080. I've just modified it to 8081. So I've changed the port on which my Tomcat server would run. All right. So that's one change. Second change, when Jenkins kind of tries to get into my Tomcat and deploy something for someone, he would need some authentications so that he'll be allowed deployment by Tomcat. So for that, I need to create a user on Tomcat and provide this user credentials to my Jenkins instance. So I would go to Tomcat users.xml file here. I've already created a username called deployer and the password is deployer, and I've added a role called manager-script. Manager-script will allow programmatic access to the Tomcat server. So this is the role that is there. So using this credentials, I will enable or I'll empower Jenkins to get into my Tomcat server and deploy my application. All right, only these two things that is required. Let me just start my Tomcat server first. So I get into my bin folder, I open a command prompt here, and there's a startup.bat. It's pretty fast. It just takes a few seconds. Yes, there you go. Tomcat server is up and running. Now this is running on port 8081. So let me just check if that looks good. So localhost 8081. Okay, my Tomcat server is up and running. That sounds good. The user is already configured on this. That's also fine. So what I'll do as a part of my first job, Maven is also installed on my system. So I'm good to use Maven as a part of my Jenkins. So I will put up a simple job now. I will say job. MVN web app. I'll call this freestyle job. That's good. Okay, so this will be a Git repository. What is the URL of my Git repository? Is this guy, HTTPS URL. Okay, that's this URL. I will use the credentials. The old credentials that I set up will work well because it's the same Git user that I'm kind of connecting into. All right. So now the change happens here where after I get this, since I said this is a simple Maven repository, I will have some Maven targets to run. So the simple target first is let me run Maven package. This creates a war file. Okay, so MVN package is the target. Package is the target. So whenever I run this package, it kind of creates it, it builds it, it tests it, and then creates a package. So this is all that is required. Maybe let me try to save this and let me first run this and see if it connects well, if there's any problem with my war file or the war file gets created properly. Okay, wonderful. So it built a war file, and if you see, it all shows you what is the location where this war file was generated. So this will be the workspace. If you see this war file was successfully built. Now I need to grab this particular war file and then I would need to deploy it into Tomcat server. Again, I would need a small plugin to do this because I need to connect Tomcat with my Jenkins server. Let me go ahead and install the plugin for the container deployment. So I will go to manage plugins, available, type in container, container, deploy to container. Okay, so this would is the plugin that I would need. I would install it without a restart. Right, seems to be very fast. Nope, sorry, it's still installing. Okay, it installed the plugin. So if at all you see this, if you go to my workspace, okay, in the target folder, I would see this web application war file that is already built. So I would need to configure this plugin to pull up this war file and deploy it onto the Tomcat server. For deploying onto the Tomcat server, I will use the credentials of the user that I've created. Okay, so let me go to configure this particular project again. And okay, all this is good. So the package is good. I'm going to just create a package. That's all fine. Now add a post build step. So after the war file is built as a part of this package directive, let me use this deployment to container. Now this will show up after you install the plugin. So deploy this one to the container. Now what is that you're supposed to specify? You're supposed to specify what is the location. Okay, so this is a global configuration that is there that will allow you to, from the root folder, it will pick up the war file that is there. So ****star.war, that's good for me. Okay, what is the context path? Context path is nothing but just the name of an application that, under which it will get deployed into the Tomcat server. I will just say MVN web app. That's the name of my thing. Now I need to specify what kind of a container that I'm talking about. All right, so the deployment would be for this Tomcat 8.5 is what I need. Okay, because the server that we have is a Tomcat 8.5 server that I have. So this would be the URL. So the credentials, yes, I need to add a credential for this particular server. So if you remember, I had created a credential for my web application. So let me just find that. My Tomcat server, yes, configuration of this. Okay, so deployer and deployer. Username is deployer, password is deployer. Okay, so let me use that credential. I would say add a new credential, Jenkins credential. The username is deployer and the password is deployer. So I would use this deploy credentials for that. And what is the URL of my Tomcat instance? So this is the URL of my Tomcat instance. So take the war file that is found in this particular folder, and then context path is Maven web app. Use the deployment credentials and get into this localhost, which is there 8081. This is the Tomcat server that is running on my system, and then go ahead and deploy it. Okay, so that is all that is required. So I would say just save this and let me run it now. Okay, it successfully built the war file. It is trying to deploy it, and looks like the deployment went ahead perfectly well. So the context path was MVN web app. So if I type in this, right, if at all I go ahead into my Tomcat server, there would be a web apps folder. You would see the the date timestamp. So this is the file that got recently copied, and this is the Explorer version of our application. So the application was built, the source code of this application was pulled from the GitHub server. It was built locally on the Jenkins instance, and then it was pushed into a Tomcat server, which is running on a different port, which is 8081. Now for this demo, I'm running everything locally on my system, but assuming that, this particular Tomcat instance was running on some other server with some other different IP address, all that you got to go and change is the URL of the server. So this would be the server in case you already have that, if you have a Tomcat server which is running on some other machine, that's all fine. With a different IP, that's all good enough. The whole bundle or the war file that was built as a part of this Jenkins job gets transferred onto the other server and gets deployed. That's the beauty of Jenkins and automatic deployments, or rather deployments using Jenkins and Maven. Distributed build or master slave configuration in Jenkins. As you would have seen, we just have one instance of Jenkins server up and running all the time. And also I told you that whenever any job that kind of, gets started on the Jenkins server, it is little heavy on in terms of disk space and the CPU utilization. So which kind of, if at all you're in an organization wherein you're heavily reliant on the Jenkins server, you don't want your Jenkins server to go down. So that's wherein you kind of start distributing the load that is there on the Jenkins server. So you primarily have a server, which is just a placeholder or like a master who will take in all the kind of jobs. And what he'll do is based upon trigger that has happened to the job or whichever job needs to be built, if at all, he can delegate these jobs onto some other machines or some other slaves. That's a wonderful thing to have. Okay, use case one. Use case two, assuming that, if you have a Jenkins server that is running on a Windows box or on a Linux one, and if at all you have a need where you need to build based upon operating systems, you have multiple build configurations to support. Maybe you need to build a Windows, Windows based .NET kind of a projects where you would need a Windows machine to build this particular project. You also have a requirement where you want to build Linux based systems. You also have a Mac, you support some sort of an apps or something that is built on Mac OS. You would need to build, Mac based system as well. So how are you going to support all these needs? So that's wherein a beautiful concept of master slave or primary and delegations or agent and master comes into play. So typically you would have one Jenkins server who will just configure with all the proper authorizations, users, configurations, and everything is set up on this Jenkins server. His job is just delegations. He will listen to some sort of triggers, or based upon the job that is coming in, he will, if there is a nice way of delegating these jobs to somebody else and taking back the results, he can control a lot of other systems. And these systems may not have a complete, or there's no need to put in a complete Jenkins installation. All that you got to do is have a very, very simple runner or a slave that is a simple jar file that is run as a low priority thread or a process within these systems. So with that, you can have a wonderful distributed build server that can be set up. And in case one of the servers goes down, your master would know that what went down and kind of delegate the task to somebody else. So this is the kind of distributed build or the master slave configuration. So what I'll do in this exercise or in this demo is I will set up a simple slave. But since I don't have too many machines to kind of play around, what I'll do is I will set up a slave in one other folder within my hard drive. So I've got the C drive and D drive. my Jenkins is on my C drive. So what I would do is I would just use my E drive and set up a very simple slave out there. I'll just show you how to provision a slave and how to connect to a slave and how to delegate a job to that slave. Let me go back to my Jenkins master and configure him to talk to an agent. So there are various ways in which this client and server talk to each other. What I'm going to choose is something called as JNLP, Java Network Launch Protocol. So using this, I would ensure that the client and server talk to each other. So for that, I need to ensure that I kind of enable this JNLP port. So let me try to find out where is that. Let me try this. Okay, yes, agents, and by default, this JNLP agents thing would be disabled. So if you see here, there's a small help on this. So I'm going to use this JNLP, which is nothing but Java Network Launch Protocol. And I'll configure the master and server to talk to each other using JNLP. So for that, I need to enable this guy. So I enable this guy instead of making by default, the configuration was disabled. So I make him random. I make him, enabled, and I say save this configuration. All right. So now I configured or I made a setting for the master so that the JNLP port is kind of opened up. So let me go ahead and create an agent. So I'll go to manage nodes. So if you see here, there's only one master here. So let me provision a new node here. So this is the way in which you bring up a new node. You have to configure it on the server. Jenkins would put in some sort of security around this particular agent and let you know how to launch this particular agent so that he can connect to your Jenkins master. So I would say new node. I would give a name for my node. I would say Windows node because both of these are Windows only. So that's fine. I just give an identifier saying that Windows node. I would say this is a permanent agent. I would say okay. So if you see the name, let me just copy this name here with the description. Number of executors, since it's a slave node and both of these are running on my system, I will keep the number of executors as 1. That's fine. Remote root directory. Now this is where, let me just clarify this, since I have both my master is running on my C drive program files 86, or hang on, not 86, C colon program files. It is indeed 86. All right, Jenkins. So this is where my master is running. So I don't want the C drive. What I'll do is I'll use something called as A drive. I have another drive in my system, but please visualize this like, you're running this on a separate system altogether. So I create a folder here called Jenkins node, and this is where I'm going to place I'm going to provision my slave, and I'm going to run him from here. So this is the directory in which I'm going to provision my slave node. So I'm going to copy this here, and that is the remote root directory of your particular agent or slave. So I just copy it here. The label, probably this is fine for me. And usage, how do you want to use this guy? So I don't want him to run all kinds of jobs. I will only build jobs with label expressions that match this particular node. And so this is the label of this node. So in order for somebody to kind of delegate any task to them, they will have to specify this particular label. So imagine this way, if I have a bunch of Windows mesh system, I name it as Windows star. Anything that starts from Windows, I can give a regular expression and say that anything that matches Windows, run this particular task there. If I have some Mac machines, I name all these Mac agents as Mac star or something like that. And I can delegate all tasks, saying that start with whatever starts with Mac in this node, run the Mac jobs there. So you identify a node using the label and then delegate the task there. All right. So launch method, we will use Java Web Start because we're going to use JNLP protocol. Okay, that sounds good. Directory, I think nothing else is required. Availability, yes, we'll keep this agent, yep, online as much as possible. That sounds good. All right, let me save this. All right, I'm just provisioning this particular node now. So if I click on this node, I get a bunch of commands along with an agent.jar. So this is the agent.jar that has to be taken down to the other machine or the slave node. And from there, I need to run this along with a small security credential. So let me copy this whole text here in my notepad. Notepad plus plus is good for me. Okay. I copy this whole path there. I also want to download this agent.jar. I would say yes. This agent.jar is the one that is configured by our server. So all the details that is required for launching this agent.jar is found in this. For launching this agent is found in this agent.jar. So typically I need to take this jar file onto the other system and then kind of run it from there. So I have this agent.jar. I copy this, or rather I cut this. I come back to my folder, my Jenkins node. I paste it here. Okay. So now with this provision agent.jar, and I need to use this whole command, Control A, Control C, and then launch this particular agent. So let me bring up a command prompt right here and then launch it. So I'm saying in the same folder where there is agent.jar, I'm going to launch this particular agent, java-jar, agent.jar, JNLP. This is the URL of my server. In case the server and client are on different locations or different IPs, you have to specify the IP address. All this anyway would show up. And then the secret and the root folder of your Jenkins or the slave node. Okay. So something ran and then it says it's connected very well. It seems to have connected very well. So let me come back to my Jenkins instance and see, if at all you see earlier this was not connected. Now let me refresh this guy. Okay, now these two guys are connected. Provision a Jenkins node, and then I copied all the credentials of the slave.jar along with the launch code and then took it to the other system and kind of ran it from there. Since I don't have another system, I've just got a separate directory in another folder, another drive, and I'm launching the agent from here. As long as this particular agent is up and running, or this command prompt is up and running, the agent would be connected. So once I close this, the connection goes down. All right, so successfully we've launched this particular agent. Now this would be the home directory of this Jenkins node or the Jenkins slave. So any task that I'm going to delegate to this particular slave would all be run here. It will create a workspace right here. All right, so good. So let me just come back and let me kind of put up a new task here. I will say that, delegate job is good. I say freestyle project. I'm going to create a very, very simple job here. I don't want it to connect to Git or anything like that. Let me just create a very, very simple echo delegated to the slave, delegated to, I don't like the word slave, delegated to agent. Put this way. All right. So delegated to agent sounds good. Now, how am I going to ensure that this particular job runs on the agent or on the slave that I've configured? Right? Do you see this? If at all you remember how we provisioned our particular slave, we gave a label, right? So now I'm going to put in a job that will only match this particular label. So I'm going to say that whatever matches this, Windows label, run this job on that particular node. So we have only one node that's matching this, Windows node. So this job will be delegated out there. So I save this and let me build this. This is again a very, very simple job. There's nothing in this. I just want to demonstrate how to kind of delegate it to an agent. So if you see this, it ran successfully. And where is the workspace? The workspace is right inside our Jenkins node. It created a new workspace, delegated job, it put in here. So my old or my primary master job is in SQL program files under Jenkins. And this is the slave job that was successfully run. Very, very simple, but very, very powerful concept of master slave configuration or distributed build in Jenkins. Okay, approaching the final section where we've done all this hard work in bringing up our Jenkins server, configuring it, putting up some jobs on it, creating users and all this stuff. Now, we don't want this configuration to kind of go away. We want a very nice way of ensuring that we back up all this configuration. And in case there is any failure, hardware crash or a machine crash, we will want to kind of restore from the existing configuration that we kind of backed up. So one quick way to do that would be, or one dirty way to do that would be just, take a complete backup of our C program files Jenkins directory, because that's where our whole Jenkins configuration is present. But we don't want to do that. Let's use some plugins for taking up a backup. So let me go to Manage Jenkins and click on Available. And let me search for some There are a bunch of backup plugins. So I would recommend one of these plugins that I specifically use. So this is the backup plugin. So let me go ahead and install this plugin. All right, so we went ahead and installed this plugin. So let me come back to my manage plugins. So this plugin is there. So hang on, backup manager. So you will see this option once you install this plugin. So first time I can do a setup. I would say backup this particular. I'll give a folder. This folder is pertaining to the folder where I want Jenkins to back up some data, and I would say the format should be zip format is good enough. Let me give a name or a template or a file name for my backup. This is good. I want it in verbose mode. I don't want to shut on my Jenkins, or should I shut it down? No. Okay. One thing that you got to remember is that whenever a backup happens, if there are too many jobs that is running on the server, it can kind of slow down your Jenkins instance, because it's in the process of copying few of those things, and if the files are being changed at that moment, it's a little bit problematic for Jenkins. So typically you back up your servers only when there is very less load, or typically try to bring it to a shutdown kind of a state and then take a backup. All right, so I'm going to back up all these things. I don't want to exclude anything else. I want the history. I want the Maven artifacts. Possibly I don't want this guy. I would just say save, and then I would say back him up. So this would run a bunch of steps, and all the files that is required as a part of this is pretty fast. But then if at all you have too many things up on your server, for now we didn't have too many things up on our server, but in case you had too many things to kind of back up, this may take a while. So let me just pause this recording and get back to you once the backup is complete. So there you go. The backup was successful. Created a backup of all the workspace, the configurations, the users, and all that. So all this is kind of hidden down in this particular zip file. So at any instance, if at all I kind of crash my system for some instance, or say hard disk failure, and I bring up a new instance of Jenkins, I can kind of use the backup plugin for restoring this particular configurations. So how do I do that? I just come back to my manage Jenkins, come back to backup manager, and I will say restore Hudson or Jenkins configuration. That concludes our tutorial on Jenkins. Thank you for stopping by and watching this video. Hope it was useful for you and inspired you to get your hands dirty with Jenkins and play around with it. For more learnings, please do visit us at www.simplilearn.com. Have a great day.
Hi there, if you like this video, subscribe to the Simplilearn YouTube channel and click here to watch similar videos. To nerd up and get certified, click here.